Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode.
So, on this week's episode, we are sharing one of our favorite conversations with local art collectors, Brian Holland and Dianna Wynn. They actually shared a lot of interesting information about their perspective as art collectors, including stewardship and building artist collector relationships. And it's something that, like, in conversation with other artists, we've recalled. So we definitely want to share it with you.
Yeah, I also love how they discuss the power of artists talking directly to their audiences and really leaning into other passions in order to find momentum with their creative body of work.
Absolutely. And this is an episode that was originally 98, if you wanted to go back on our catalog. It was released about 2 years ago, but again, it's one of those that it still resonates today. Like the type of advice that they shared was so timeless that we actually wanted to bring it up and share it with you guys again. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Brian and Diana. Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find a podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. On today's episode, we are so excited to have Diana and Brian with us. So welcome.
Thank you.
We're glad you decided to join us today. So we're looking forward to discussing with you the art collector's point of view. But before we dive in, let's share a little bit more about your backgrounds for listeners who may not be familiar with you. So first, Diana is a communication consultant with over 30 years of experience delivering skills training, group facilitation, and strategic messaging services to businesses, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and adult learners. She is committed to helping clients develop a more mindful and strategic approach to communication grounded in best practices and relevant social science research. She currently serves on the National Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters, is a former college professor, and has co-authored several college-level textbooks. So this is very exciting, Diana. Looking forward to speaking to you. And then we have Brian, who is an attorney who in his role as general counsel helps companies identify, mitigate, and manage risks to enable the best business decisions. Brian has held the general counsel position for both publicly and privately held technology companies and was a litigator with firms in Dallas and Washington, D.C. Brian currently serves as chair on the board for Capital Area Workforce Development, a collaborative group of professionals passionate about driving local and regional economic growth through effective, innovative workforce development. In their spare time, Diana and Brian enjoy learning about and collecting contemporary art. They place a special emphasis on supporting the work of local and regional artists. And also, Diana previously served on the board of directors for Art Space in downtown Raleigh. So, welcome, guys.
I'm glad
Thank
to
you.
be here.
It's great to be here.
And so you two were part of a panel discussion that we had at Art Space that I unfortunately was unable to make, but I know Adriana and you guys connected during that talk. I heard nothing but amazing praises about your talk and your insight. And so we're so excited to be talking more about your experience in the art world, especially as being such local art scene that Adriana and I and many of our listeners are part of too.
Well, I'm just surprised to be referred to as a prominent figure. We're just we're thrilled to be able to meet artists like you all and discover great art here in North Carolina.
Yeah. So how did you first start collecting art? And do you remember what like your first acquisition was? How did that whole process begin for you two?
How about I take that first, Brian?
Sure.
The first art I remember purchasing was about 35 years ago from a couple artists at the Torpedo Factory in Alexandria, Virginia.
Yes.
And the Torpedo, we were living in the DC area at the time. The Torpedo Factory is really kind of the model that Art Space looked to when they were looking to develop the space here in Raleigh. And we purchased several serigraphs, I believe they're called, from an artist named Clay Huffman at the time, and a ceramic sculpture. But let me add something to your question. You said, when did you start collecting? And I will tell you, it isn't until relatively recently here in North Carolina that we have accepted that we are considered collectors. We did not consider ourselves art collectors. We just bought art that we wanted to live with. And we've accepted the term because others kept introducing us as collectors. And it has made me think a little more deeply about some of my responsibilities when I think of myself that way. But anyway, it started about 35 years ago.
Nice.
And Brian may have something to add.
Yeah, same thing as what Diana's saying. I still haven't gotten used to thinking of myself as a collector. We were people who just bought things that we happened to like. And I remember that first time we were in the Torpedo Factory when I met Clay. It was the first time I ever think I talked to somebody who I could really consider a real artist. And he was doing serigraphs, screen printing. And I had done a lot of screen printing growing up, not from an artistic standpoint, but making posters, T-shirts. I used to work in a print shop before I went to college, and getting to have that conversation and connect with him. And the image that we bought is a collection of fireworks. And it amazed me from a technical perspective because he had 70 different screens in this piece, and it's colorful and beautiful. And I was also addicted to fireworks when I was growing up. And apparently Clay was too. So we were talking, and so I'm a very shy person, but getting to talk to somebody who had some similar interests growing up, was engaged in a process I was familiar with. It was just a very different, like I said, wasn't thinking of myself as a collector, but that's one of the things that I like about collecting now is being able to have that engagement and connection with artists. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of the fun comes from.
Yeah, and I feel like that is an important distinction between someone that just buys art occasionally and or is just an art buyer looking to resell later and an actual collector. I feel like collectors want that personal connection, want to learn more about the story, interact with the artist. So it goes a little bit farther, I feel like. But I love all these different threads that are coming through. So my grandpa, he actually he used to do serigraphs and lithographs back in the day. So he was a printmaker. And that's what I grew up around, a store and then he specialized into screen printing. So he did all kinds of printmaking. But then he actually sold the supplies and the equipment and was helping other artists and did workshops. And then he had this building and all these employees anyway. So I grew up around that. And that I thought was interesting as a kid as well, being able to talk to other artists. Not that I really knew it at the time, right? It's only years later in retrospect that you're like, that is so cool that artists actually talked to me and told me about this photosensitive process and cleaning a screen and things like that. That at the time as a kid, I'm like, okay, cool. I can make cool things. But now I'm like, no, they actually took that time. And I like how that seed sometimes can be planted earlier on. And it's a good reminder to artists, do talk to, to folks that you're interacting with, especially if a lot of artists I feel like are introverted anyways. So it's a good thing to be able to find that common ground, and you never know, what else may arise from it.
Yeah, an important thing to understand for artists to understand, especially if they're introverted, is a lot of the buyers are introverted.
Yeah, Brian and I are both actually pretty extreme introverts. We can go out and engage, but that is not kind of our natural way of moving through the world. So maybe that's why we've gravitated toward the arts community. It's comfortable for us too. Yeah.
Yeah, I offer to a term I found online that I've kept hearing and I keep repeating it because I love it. It's this term of being an artrovert. And it's basically an introvert that will talk about art. And once we get going, we don't stop very fast. So there's that. But with with that tying back into the art, I'd like to ask you guys, what kind of art do you normally gravitate towards?
Do you want to take that one, Diana? Or
Sure. I mean,
yeah.
I think, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, we have now a general commitment to living local and regional artists. We are not at the level of going to Sotheby's and bidding on Jackson Pollocks and Pablo Picassos. And so when we started thinking about, okay, I guess we are collecting, should we have a focus? And we don't really have a focus, but there is that commitment because we don't buy names just because it's a famous signature. We don't care. And because you can find amazing art, and just because it's not famous doesn't mean it's not great art. So in general, they're contemporary themes, and it range from figurative to abstract. We have a lot of art that addresses socio-political issues like racism, body image, the objectification of women, gun violence. So they often have this kind of implicit narrative in them. When I was thinking about our art not too long ago for that panel at ArtSpace, I started realizing how many works we had that are also representations of objects, which I often find just an object beautiful. So we have a couple sculptures from Peter Oakley, a North Carolina artist. One's of a styrofoam takeout box. One's of a Viewmaster. Remember those old reels you'd put and click through? And they're in marble, but they look like the real thing. A piece that's only about 3 inches tall that looks like a tube of lipstick, but it's in steel. So it also looks kind of like a bullet. It's called lipstick ammunition. A couple beautiful mezzotents by an artist named Carol Wax, not in North Carolina, of a vintage electric fan. And the other ones I think of a German coffee grinder, maybe something like. Oh, it's a telephone. Several years ago, I happened to be just walking around my house, and it occurred to me that almost every piece in the house had text in it. And we didn't set out to do that. And text other than the artist's signature, that it had sometimes all text, sentences or a sentence or a phrase or a word, and sometimes just letters or numbers. And we've purchased quite a bit, since I recognize that. And so I wouldn't say that you would notice as much text. So there's a lot of text-based work, but Brian and I are often find ourselves drawn to text-based work. And a great North Carolina artist, we've got a couple of her pieces. Stacey Lynn Waddell out of Durham. We have some of her gold leaf text-based works, and then some are completely abstract. So I don't think that there's any one theme, except that it is all very contemporary. Brian, did you have anything to add to or pieces that pop into your mind?
Yeah, it's interesting because Diana and I often find ourselves drawn to the same artist. We'll go to a show and then we'll talk afterwards, and it's like we love the same artist. What's amazing is we often disagree on the pieces that we like best. So something will grab me, something will grab Diana, but there's something about that artist, about the way they work, that ends up speaking to both of us. And I think some of the individual pieces that we've picked up speak to each of us differently, but in some same ways. Like we have a Melinda Fine piece. We have a number of Melinda's works, but there's one that we have, the very first one we bought, that I bought for Diana as a gift. But it is it was made with Letraset letters. And I don't know if you guys are even old enough to remember Letraset, but those were those rub-on letters that you put on a thing, and you get a sheet and it would have like 20 different letters of each letter, and then you have to rub it in. And I used to use that when I was working as a screen printer and doing other things. And so there was something very nostalgic to me about those pieces, even though they're not necessarily, and this one's definitely not a nostalgic piece, but it spoke to me from that perspective. But there was something else that grabbed Diana about it. That was one of those ones where we both really loved the exact same piece from the same artist. But I do think it's odd how violently we agree on the artist sometimes, and then just crazily divergent in terms of which of their pieces we like best. So
Yeah.
it
So
leads to some interesting
how do we
discussions.
like resolve that? Yeah, there's some
Oh,
discussion that goes on.
well, we resolve it easily because we get the one Diana liked.
I mean, we do work through it, but there have been times where he'd say, "No, I'm not really interested in that. Not interested," and then I just go back and I buy it, and then I bring it in. And then when it's in the home, it grows on him, or he sees it differently. I
Yeah.
do think I'm pretty good and I've gotten better over the years about looking at work, and trying to look at it outside of its context. So when you go into a studio or a gallery, you are surrounded by all of this work, and in a studio, all sorts of working materials. And you have to be able to almost put blinders on to focus on individual pieces and try to visualize those works in a different context. And I've just learned that over time.
Yeah.
So yes, Brian has always come around. I don't think we have anything in the home that I brought home that he dislikes.
Yeah, and I think that's such a fun skill to also develop together too, because I'm sure, of course, your tastes maybe over time have changed, or what your eye is drawn towards must, like us as artists, like our creative voices change, our messaging changes, or the quote unquote style, the creative voice that you're putting out there. Also, as collectors, you're also constantly fine tuning, whether consciously or subconsciously. Dan, I love how you talked about, like, you just turned around one day and you're like, wait, everything in our collection has text in it. Or like you're not consciously going through your checklist of these are the things I like, but you just like what you like. And when you have them all in a collection together, then you see those common threads. Just like as artists, you make work that you're drawn towards, and then you put it all together and you see those tie-ins from piece to piece. And so you guys mentioned that you'll go to artist studios or exhibitions, but I am curious, we'll pitch this question to you, Brian. How do you discover new artists whose art you would like to collect? Of course, you may have your favorite artists that you have multiple pieces of, but for brand new artists, where do you go to discover them, or how do you discover them?
Well, as Diana said, we don't necessarily think of ourselves as collectors, so it's not necessarily intentional. It's serendipitous most of the time. We happen to be somewhere and see something that we really like. So we'll go to shows that have multiple artists in it and run across something we haven't seen, or something new that an artist we're familiar with is done. So that's one of the great things about Art Space, CMAC, Anchor Light, where you can see a lot of different artists and see them rotate through, and just run into things that you wouldn't otherwise normally see. And then sometimes you got to go to Lump, because they will bring
Yes.
things into Lump that you're never going to see anywhere else. And
Very
we have just
interesting.
fallen in love with some pieces there. In fact, in one instance, Diana bought a piece that they weren't planning on selling, not because it wasn't for sale, because they just didn't think anybody would want to buy it. So they hadn't even considered possibly selling it. So a lot of it's serendipity. Sometimes it's, a lot of it's going to shows. Every once in a while, look up an artist that I've run across where I like what they're doing, and look up on the web. And one of the wonderful things about those algorithms, because there are a lot of bad things about the algorithms too, but it'll show you similar things. And I've run across artists and art that way, that I liked. Haven't collected a lot of it because most of our collecting is local, so a lot of it is what we see here locally. But that's at least how I run into things.
Yeah,
Diana?
I mean, I'd say we're similar. I'm on social media, and Brian is not. So if I find out about an artist that I think I'm interested in, I'll often start following them on Instagram and Facebook. But how do I originally find out? Again, we show up to art events. So we are at receptions. If we can't make the reception, we'll often go to the gallery at a different time. And so we discover artists, we see their work and discover them, that way very often. So I think that, if artists are wondering, how do I, be seen?
Mhm.
Try to get your work into galleries. And for us, it doesn't matter what that gallery is. I've gone to art exhibitions here locally and in some other places where, you'd never. In one case, I wondered whether the building was even, legal. I don't know if legally people should be in the building, but we bought a couple fantastic things and kind of a pop-up exhibition. I am on the email list for a lot of galleries and of course museums, and so when they have a new exhibition, I'll go to the website to see what kind of work is in the exhibition. In fact, there's a frame shop and gallery, Craven, over in Durham, and their frame shop is on the street level, though they have art for sale there too, but they have a gallery in the basement level, and I hadn't been there. This is a few years ago, but I got an email. I was clicking through, the works, and the exhibition was work by Beverly McKeever, and I wasn't familiar with her then. We were still relatively new to North Carolina, and I saw a piece I loved. And so because I was interested in that piece, I wanted to see the exhibition. So I went to the exhibition for the first time. And that was before, I think, the documentary about her and her sister was made. And now she's enjoying a lot more success. And I ended up purchasing, that piece. And Brian's right. You, you need to go to places like Lump Gallery that are, off the beaten path, and you're going to see work. And often what I'll see are artists that I'm unfamiliar with, and what I'll immediately do is follow them on Instagram. So, I'm not discovering them on social media. I'm following them so I can learn more about their work, and eventually we may have a piece in our home as a result.
Yeah.
Nice.
What I'm really finding interesting is that what I thought was largely serendipitous was Diana making plans based on stuff she saw on Instagram and then dragging me along with her. And
Yeah.
I just thought we were stumbling onto these things, but apparently that's not the case.
No. Hey, I would add one more thing. I love. I know that some artists, their goal is that solo exhibition, right? And if it's a group show, I've heard artists say, "Well, it's just a group show." I love, from a collector standpoint of view, I love group exhibitions because it means I get to see the work of a variety of artists. And very often I'm going there because of one particular artist's work, but then I end up buying a work by an artist that I wasn't aware of before. So I think group shows are a great way for people to get their art out and seen if people don't know about their work yet.
Mhm.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And to add a little bit of the artist's perspective on that side, I think it depends on the venue and what the acceptance rate is at the group show. So a 3-person invitational group show for us artists has a lot more cachet than one that has 125 artists and everybody got accepted and we're like,
Oh, sure,
um,
sure. Where it's not really what I would call, curated.
yeah,
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 yeah. No,
yeah.
you want curated shows.
We do, we do. So
Yeah.
sometimes if you hear that might be one of those. So it's all right. They all have merit, and depending on where an artist's career level is at, I mean, they're there for everybody. So I love that there's the full range. Now, I do want to ask you, I want to recap real quick a few of the gems you guys have dropped and then kind of go from there. So far I've heard some of the things that y'all like to see is or discover new artists, if you will. One of them is going to be the algorithms, and social media apparently can help with that. So don't lose faith on the Instagrams of the world. Post there, obviously. The other one is group shows. The other ones is actually having work in perhaps not as well known establishments, like different galleries or the basement of a frame shop, like you said. So it sounds like those are some big ones. I think if I recall correctly from that panel, another one that was mentioned was museum events. And then of course there's like all sorts of exhibition openings, you know, some more interactive than others. But as a somewhat introverted artist, sometimes, and also one that has a what word am I looking for? I have one of those, like, I'm very driven in terms of making the art, but I'm very nose to the grindstone. Jackie's my witness to this. Very nose to the grindstone. So for me, it's hard to leave the hermit cave of the studio, even though I am in a public facing one. If artists were to say, where are they more likely or more, this sounds like a terrible expression. I'm like, bang for buck is not the right one, but for someone that's like trying to be mindful of the energy that they're spending and the time they're spending outside their studio, if you had to pick one type of event and or venue that you say, artists, if you do nothing else, show up to X, what would it be? If you had to pick one thing for artists to show up at to be discovered, just one, what would you highly recommend that they do? So Diana, do you want to share first?
Yeah,
And then
sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. But
yes.
I would say, and I do understand, but as a fellow introvert, you know, that fear of, am I going to show up and not know anybody there? And then what do I do? Just stand around, right? I mean, that is the introvert's challenge. Um, and I would say, if they were going to choose one thing, it would be art opening receptions, um, where you tend to have more people showing up, so they're more likely to also be collectors there. I would also suggest that might be more comfortable for artists because they're more likely to see some artists showing up that they're familiar with. But I do think artists need to show up to arts events for a variety of reasons. That's where they're going to meet collectors, and so I've met a number of artists before I've even seen their work, because someone introduced me at a reception, or you know, they were standing beside me and I didn't know if they were one of the artists, so I'd say, do you know anything about this artist? And then we, you know, we talk. But I also think there are other reasons for them to show up at exhibitions, whether they're at museums or galleries, or social type art events, because uh, you become more connected to the arts community. And I think that artists or any professional needs to be connected to their colleagues, and you know, they're also supporting their fellow artists when they show up to those kinds of things. But more likely to be an art reception for an exhibition where it's less formal, people are milling around, easier to strike up a conversation, and there are enough people there where it may make an artist, it it may make it worthwhile in terms of time. So you're not showing up and there are only two people in the gallery, and they don't collect. So yeah, I hope that helps answer the question.
It does. It does. How about you, Brian? What would you
Yeah,
pick?
when I was originally listening to the question, I was thinking about, you know, where can you, one place you can get your art where it might be seen. Um, but I like the way and that may not have been the way you made it. You may have read it the way Diana meant. But talking about where you can get yourself, I think probably is more important. And because that then leads to opportunities for your art to be seen. Uh, and I think what Diana was saying about getting to art events is really, really important. And this is a weird one. I like going to like the open house at Anchor Light. I like going to First Friday at Art Space, where there are a lot of people around and you're talking. Uh, what I personally don't like, and this is the introvert coming out of me, is when I'm wandering around Art Space on an off time, and there's sometimes I don't even want to talk to anyone. I just want to look at the stuff. So I don't want to talk to the artist right then. Uh, but then after looking at the pieces, I might want to. But there's something easier about the events when they're intended to be social, as opposed to something that feels a little more forced. That I think, particularly for artists who are introverts and buyers who are introverts, it creates that opportunity to interact. And you know, I've had great conversations with a lot of artists at both Art Space and Anchor Light, that I know I never would have had if I had just walked in and talked to them. Now, one of the other things I would suggest, though, is if you are an artist and doing something else, don't shy away from talking about your art. I remember one situation where Diane and I we were having dinner at Moonlight Pizza, and we are sitting at the bar and we're talking to the bartender who we knew. I mean, because we talked to him a number of times because we used to eat at Moonlight Pizza an awful lot. And then it comes up that he's, an artist and a musician. And so we start talking about his music, we start talking about his art. And Diana says, "Well, what's your name?" And he says, "Will Goodyear." And we're like, "We own one of your pieces." And that just led to a whole different level of conversation. And I was just, falling in love with Will because he's just a great guy. And we acquired another one of his pieces, a much larger piece. And that might have happened if we hadn't had those kind of interactions, but it might not have. And it was just amazing that this person who's such a talented musician, such a talented fine artist, just didn't talk about himself that way. And I would suggest, when you have the opportunity and it seems appropriate, talk about your art. You never know when it's, gonna work.
That is perfect. That leads us to a guest that we had not that long ago that you both know about as well. Sean Richards. One of his
Ah,
side jobs was as a bartender. So same thing could have happened. You could have ordered a drink from a guy who makes amazing artwork. We actually interviewed him a few episodes back, and that's when we found out the other side gigs and things like that. And it's like, what a small world, or Smalley, I guess is the
Well,
yeah,
that's another thing because we
yeah,
knew Sean and Luke Buchanan from Pools for
Fool's Diner. Yeah.
much longer than, before we knew them as artists. And actually, we own multiple pieces from both
That's
now.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that we love kind of demystifying about the life as artists on our podcast is that, especially from an emerging artist standpoint, even once you get established, there can kind of be this facade that, oh, in order to be a quote unquote real established artist, I need to be doing this full time. It has to be my full time income. And then we hear about these stories of people that work in museums, that have museum exhibitions, that are very prominent figures. And they're like, yeah, I bartend 4 nights a week, or I do art installations here, or I do shipping for this warehouse. And so I really love people's transparency with what it means to be a modern day artist, because as you guys are saying, there's also opportunities that lend themselves there. And I love what you said, Brian, too, of putting yourself out there as an artist and just as a person, because those are the things that lead to opportunities for your art. It's putting yourself out there first. And it did make me think about what was one thing that you think artists can do to stand out in a positive way, Brian?
Wow. Um, I've been thinking about this, and there are a number of things that I think artists can do. Big one is getting out there and participating in the art events, as we said. But other things that they are passionate about are things they should be thinking about. I don't think that there's no one answer. In trying to do something that's not authentic is simply not going to work. But if you're interested in social justice, be involved in social justice. Find ways to make your art speak to that. I've seen artists locally who are very interested in certain areas, and they're creating posters for those events. And some of them may not be social justice. They may just be other events around town. David Eichenberger, I love some of his posters. Skillet Gilmore, again, I love his poster work. I happen to like poster work. And I particularly like Skillet's work because
Screen
I love
printing.
silk screens. But doing those things where you can combine parts of your life in a way that's authentic, that means something to you, I think is a good way to stand out. And Diana, you may have more to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot. Mine's more really about the relationship, between the artist and the collector. And I think that it's important that artists remember. I mean, I've encountered artists over and over again that are afraid to say something that might offend me. I say things all the time and debate things with others. And I don't want anyone to think that just because you disagree with me on an issue that I wouldn't support your art. That's just how I engage sometimes. So I don't like artists feeling intimidated, by me, like, oh, if they say the wrong thing, then I'll never purchase their work. So when they put me at ease, remembering that a lot of us think of artists as rock stars. You have a creative mind and a skill set that I do not have, but have so much admiration and respect for. And I think artists need to recognize that, if they feel awkward, that they're encountering collectors and sometimes not encountering them because people don't feel the art is accessible to them to come to a gallery or studio. I would say focus on relationship building, um, and understand that what I want is. I mean, the fun of collecting for me, when we focus on local and regional artists, the advantage of doing that is we get to know the artists, and that's part of the fun. I want to know about the artist. I want to know you. I want to know your creative process. I want to know what you think of your work, because the more I understand your work, more likely I'm going to be drawn to it with that depth of understanding. And the sales may eventually follow. And the other thing that you can do, I think, to stand out in my mind in a positive way is when I see people artists who are also looking at their contribution to the arts community. So, they're thinking beyond what they personally are doing with their art. And I do think about people like Caitlin Carey. I think is a wonderful promoter of other people's art and an amazing artist herself. Paris Alexander, who's over at the City Market Artist Collective, incredible about promoting other people's work and contributing to the community. And quite frankly, you too. What you're doing with your podcast, that is a contribution to the arts community. And I just think that doing things like that are important. And so if you want to stand out in a positive way, let us get to know you. Be a good person, right? But think about your role within the larger community.
Absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. Yeah. Jackie and I, anybody that's heard the podcast has heard us say it over and over again. We're strong believers of community over competition, especially in the art
Mhm.
scene. Hey, you need this. Hey, you need that tool. Do you know how to do this technique? I'll show you this. Or have you heard of this event, this exhibition? And that exchange of information. And that's part of what led us to do the podcast. So many people helped us out when we were on the earliest stages of emerging, that we're just paying it forward essentially. And who knows who will pay forward to who. And we think that's just, I mean, art and the art world in general, art with a capital A has such a negative connotation, but art with a smaller a, right, lowercase a, there's no reason it can be this magical world and teach a little something else to other industries. So very big believers on that. But with that, I do want to ask you, and I'll let you take the lead on it first, Diana. So assuming the artist did get out there, so you already saw the art, you love it, price is not an obstacle, what would actually prevent you from investing in a particular artist?
Three things.
Oh,
Three things. Um, if I knew distasteful things about the artist personally, like they're a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe.
ooh,
I mean, that matters to me. One, I would not feel comfortable having their art in my home. We live with art. Two, I don't want to use my consumer dollars to support that kind of person or that kind of business. Now, fortunately, it's rare that an artist has those qualities. Artists very often are more progressive in their thinking about, social justice issues. Beyond that, I might look. I do sometimes consider conservation issues, and I know Brian has a different take on this. So I may ask myself, the materials that the artist is using, will they last? And can I easily maintain that work, right? I'm not an art professional, so I want to know, can I easily maintain it? And depending on the price point, honestly, if depending on what I spend, I want it to to last. I don't want it to disintegrate in my home. And the biggest barrier, though, is we have run out of wall space in our home for displaying art. There is art on every wall in every room, and unfortunately, we have what I think are too many windows, because I could have had a wall where I could have displayed art. We've addressed that in a couple ways. One, um, we do now rotate art out and in, and have a room that's climate controlled, where we can store the art when it's not on display. And we in on the second level of our home, we installed gallery rails, so art can hang from cables, making it really easy in those rooms to swap out art without putting new nail holes in the wall. And then for works on paper, because I am drawn to a lot of works on paper, and people think about art collecting as sculptural or painting, but there are amazing works on paint work on paper. And because we're so limited now in wall space, I now have a kind of a gallery rack. Think of it as a magazine rack, only several times larger. So you all have seen those racks in galleries or retail stores. And so unframed works on paper are stored there, and we enjoy them there. I flip through them every once in a while, and eventually some of them will get framed. But you have to decide, are you going to stop collecting, or are you going to find a way to continue to collect? So we've continued. So if there are barriers, it's personal things distasteful about the artist, maybe some conservation issues, and then limited in wall space. Though in one case, we have covered up a large window with a very large piece of art. So from the outside, it looks like they're just closed blinds. From the inside, you never know there's a window, because I just decided I loved that piece and we didn't need that window anymore. So
I love it. I love that go-getter attitude of you like, I will find a way to fit more art in this home. I love that. How about you, Brian?
I'm pretty much in agreement with Diana. Don't be a horrible person, because that, for me, it really is about supporting that person. I don't know how I would feel, particularly if I didn't know if I had something in my house that would, from a horrible person. I could probably still live with it, maybe until I found out they were a horrible person. But that's the big thing. I do not have the same issue Diana has with the permanence of a piece, particularly if the ephemeral nature of the piece is part of the art itself, that it is supposed to disintegrate. Diana appreciates pieces like that, but she's like, I don't want to spend my money on something that's going to disappear. I might be more willing to do that, though, because I'm not permanent either. I'm going to disappear as well. So can I enjoy it? Can I enjoy it as it falls apart? Maybe, but we really don't have any pieces like that in our house either. But that is not a big a problem for me.
Yeah, and I guess it'll depend too on the how much it is. If it's a small
That's
investment or
definitely
a big
true.
one. For sure. And my brain also goes to, have you considered putting any in your ceilings? Art that you can just look up, I'm thinking Versailles, Louis just put art everywhere, so you
Yeah.
never
A
know.
lot of stained glass artists in your future to cover those windows. And
yeah, I mean, actually, we have thought about hanging things from the ceiling, some more sculptural pieces. We have a beautiful, it's very large, though very delicate, mobile.
oh yeah,
That
love that.
and the room is furnished around the mobile. That was purchased from an artist who was kind of I think the emerging artist in residence at Art Space at the time, Chelsea Rafflow, who I think has now gone out of state. And while we don't have any of his work, a North Carolina artist from the western part of the state, Bob Trotman, who does these these sculptures in these carvings in wood of some of them are people that look like they're falling, from the sky, and they're hung from the air. But yeah, those are appealing partly because I just love their work, but also because, oh, I have ceiling space. I can use
You have a lot of options to display it. You're not restricted by, okay, I need a 18 by 24 because this is the one white opening on this wall.
I
right.
know. I don't know what kind of lawn space you have, but who knows? Maybe there'll be an outbuilding mini gallery outside at some point. Extend the house, add more rooms. You never know.
Right.
But with that, so you guys have obviously interacted with a lot of different artists. So the way that, artists present themselves online or in person versus the reality of like whether or not they're successful, obviously it's going to vary. And sometimes they're not a match at all, right? They might appear very differently from the reality. But from your perspective with interacting with so many artists, how do you define and or perceive success for artists? Diane, if you want to grab that one first.
Well, first, I'm a big believer in you should define success for yourself. So the question is asked of me, how would I define or perceive success for an artist? And I just have to preface that, the beauty of life is if you choose to, you define success for yourself. And I think that's particularly important for artists because so many have these other markers for success, like financial success. And that may not always come, and that doesn't mean that your art isn't great. And in many cases, we talked about artists having these other careers, whether they're working in the hospitality industry or working at a museum or working for a company as a graphic designer. Many of them, their goal is not to be a full-time artist. Right. And so, I think that there are some false markers of success because I think it should be individual. I know, many will look at the number and the caliber of exhibitions. And I think that, that's fair. Representation from a gallery these days, it just depends. I know artists who have chosen not to be represented, but they're really good about marketing their own work. And other artists probably could use some representation because they don't have that skill set. But again, I don't know that it's a marker of success anymore. Inclusion in a museum collection, I don't think should be a marker of success because they have maybe very different decision points. And very often museums, they're not trying to find that emerging artist, purchase their work before they become the famous artist, right? Museums are pretty conservative. They wait until they think there's a known quantity. But I do think that you define success for yourself. I do think contribution to the arts community can be another marker of success, which I've mentioned. And I would say don't pin your test for success on these high profile things because a lot of that is arbitrary, out of your control, based on luck in terms of whose radar do you get on in the art industry that then propels you to be I don't know, like the Jeff Koons of artists. But I have art in my home from local artists that I love more than if I had the funds to purchase something that Koons did. So, I think that artists need to focus on their contentment and happiness with their life as an artist. That makes sense. So again, I go back to you have to define success for yourself, and there are lots of ways to define success.
How about you, Brian?
I agree with Diana. It's very important for the individual to define success. And when we're looking at what people would consider objective markers of success, whether it's financial success or critical acclaim, I don't think people really understand how much luck has to play with that, because I see it I'm a business lawyer. I see it on the business side all the time. The most talented people are not always what we would call the most successful. The most successful companies don't always have the best products. They happen to be at the right place at the right time when a certain set of circumstances came together that propelled that success. And artists have to understand that too, that it's not completely meritorious. There is a lot of luck involved in terms of that type of success. So I think what artists need to do is step back and say, why am I doing this? Is it making me happy? Do I get something out of the creative process? Do I get something out of people enjoying my work, feeling that, acquiring that, that piece makes, in this case, my life better, in how much I appreciate the artist who can bring a vision and a story to life that I get to live with every day. And I would hope that the artist would feel successful because they brought joy to my life. Uh, so I think that, artists have to think about it. It's hard, particularly if you're trying to pay rent and so on, not to think about it in financial terms. Uh, but it's not always the case. It's about telling stories. It's about the creative process, and if you enjoy that, and if you enjoy the effect that has on other people, I think that's where you define success. And it's not even necessarily about selling a lot of pieces. So, people ask me sometimes, how do I feel if I'm successful? And I've thought about it in terms of, I could have made more money. I could have done a lot of things. But the way I've started to think about it in my life is, have I made other people's lives better? There's one of me. If I can made two people's lives better, I've done my job on this planet. And if you as an artist, you may not be selling a ton of pieces, but you really connect with one, two, three people who just have loved what you've done, you're a success.
Wow. Okay, that's it. We're done. I'm kidding. You between the two of you, I think you've hit the nail on the head too. It's that idea of, at least the way I'm, translating it, it's impact and legacy. Honestly, those are the two biggest thing. And if visual art, which is what we specialize in, obviously on the podcast, but there's many types of arts and disciplines, but it's almost like if you can communicate your authentic story through the art and the person on the other side can receive your message, right? They can read it in a way, almost like a language. And maybe in part, like say you're transmitting optimism through it, you're sharing a little bit of that, they're getting that, and then they're sharing it once again, sharing it forward, then we just made the world a better place, a little bit at a time. And, looking back, if that's your legacy, that's a wonderful legacy. It's
Mhm.
not so much about, how many dollars, but I was laughing because I was like, when you said coons, Diana, my brain goes to, y'all don't want that shark and formaldehyde that they had to redo because it was starting to wear down and smelling, and they had to
Right. I
spend
mean, there are
hundreds of
conservation issues.
thousands.
Look, I get Coons and I can appreciate his work. So it really is not a slam against him, though. He's also a master
Character.
marketer, right?
Yup.
That's what I mean by, an artist has to define success for themselves, determine what their own goals are.
Mhm, mhm. He also has
Absolutely.
a lot of kids too to support. It's a lot of mouths.
And now thinking about legacy, and thinking back to when you guys started on this journey, what is one piece of advice you wish you had heard before you had started on this collecting journey, Brian?
I don't know if I can narrow it down to just one. But from a collector's standpoint, or simply a purchaser's standpoint, uh, if I had known that the art world, at least on the level that we're dealing with, is not stuffy, and that the artists are people and have a lot of the same insecurities that I do, uh, would have been important to know. I would have had a greater interaction with them. I think that was one of the benefits I had. We talked about Clay Huffman earlier, was having a very positive interaction very early on. But the fact of the matter is, I'm incredibly intimidated by artists. They have a skill set I don't possess, I don't understand, and I really appreciate. Uh, So from that perspective, I think that's important. The other thing I wish I would have known or I would have thought about is the artist essentially running small business. And that, I can walk into a show or a gallery and saying, I really can't afford that. But now knowing I can talk to the artist and say, well, can I pay you over time for that piece? And if I would have known that was an option, I think early on, Diana and I would have purchased a lot more before we ever really started to crank up the number of pieces we bought, because it largely came about at a point in time where we could afford to just walk in and buy the pieces we liked. Early on in our lives and our careers, we saw a lot of things we would love to have owned. Uh, but the fact of the matter is, there were posters on our walls with really cheap frames because that's what we could have afforded. And I wish we would have known that it would have been possible to actually have bought the things we love at that point in time, simply by talking to the artist and working out, something that worked financially for both of us.
Mm-hmm. Like payment.
Diana?
Yeah. So the question is, what advice I wish someone had told me. So I'm going to think of it as advice I would give someone who's just starting out. And there are really two areas. One, I wish I'd learned more about art early on. In college, unfortunately, I did not take an art appreciation or an art history course. So since then, I decided to go back to not go back, but take a course in art appreciation. So kind of the basics of art at Wake Tech. Anyone can just pick up one course and do that. And I even though I was done with college, I went back and did that. And I'm doing kind of an art self-study on the Khan Academy's website. And they offer all sorts of free self-study courses. And one of them is a very extensive art history one. And I wish that I'd learned more about art early on, because I think that it would have impacted how I viewed the art along the way. And then the second thing is, if I were to give advice to someone who's, just starting out collecting, well, start thinking about yourself as a collector, because it prompts other questions like, what is your responsibility as a collector, a steward of the work? And so we've thought more about, what are our responsibilities in terms of caring for the work, like making sure some works are not in direct sunlight. Making sure that some works that are unsealed marble that we never even touch with our bare hands, insuring the work. And we were fortunate to have insurance when the tornadoes came through downtown Raleigh a few years ago, but our home was seriously damaged, and we did have insurance, and fortunately we only lost one piece of art, but then had to have a lot reframed. Thinking about things like, will you make your art in your home available for that artist to borrow for a later exhibition? What's your relationship going to be with the artist in the future? And quite frankly, what happens to your art collection after you die? We don't have kids, and some people have kids. That doesn't mean their kids want it. So we gave a lot of thought to that. Actually, have a plan for what happens. So learn about art, and then think about your role as a steward of that art in your collection.
Absolutely love that. Yeah. Maybe when one of those artists is like, Whitney retrospective, I need my pieces back, and you're like, yep, I've taken care of them. Yeah, go ahead and borrow them. That's amazing. Well, if someone were to just, hand you $100, what would you splurge it on or invest in? Has to be something that brings you joy and relates to your art or business. Mainly art. Let's just keep it with art.
Brian, you want to take this one?
That's a hard one because Diana has me on an art buying moratorium at the moment. Mainly because as you said, we don't have any space at the moment. But the reality is that we often tell ourselves we're on an art buying moratorium. So from that perspective, I don't have my eye on anything in particular. But yeah, if I were to really see something that I wanted, I would for $100, I would buy it.
Yeah.
You know, I will. It's in that case, I'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission. So,
Well, and Diana, I like the idea too that you gave of doing like an art appreciation course too. That might be, it's virtual, it's another way, or perhaps if if an artist has some kind of event or they have, because that's the other thing, instead of buying the art, perhaps it's one of those openings or like art preview nights and whatnot, where like say the museum is using the money to raise funds. Well, there you go. There's $100 gone really easily. So maybe that's the other answer. Would you add anything else to that,
I was
Dan?
going to say the monster drawing rally we can get to.
Yeah, that's true.
The Monster Drawing Rally at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And I have to tell you, we have
Yes.
purchased a number of those. Normally I think they're priced at $50, or
Perfect.
they were. And I will tell you, I love those pieces for $50 as much as I love anything we spent $5,000 on. I mean, it really, the marker of joy for us is no different. And I do set these art buying moratoriums from time to time over the years. We always violate it. It's only February, so I'm not confident that will last the year, but kind of taking a break, and so yeah, I agree with Brian. You put $100 in my hands, I'm going to go buy a piece of art from a local, probably young emerging artist to help support, their practice.
Absolutely love that. Well, maybe we'll see you down at Art Space sometime soon. If you have $100 bill in your hand, there's a lot of artists there that amazing work to choose from. Well, thank you guys so much for being on the podcast today. It has been so much fun talking to you. But before we go, how can listeners stay connected to you after they listen to today's episode?
If people or artists want to connect with me, I think the best way to do that is look me up on social media. So I'm on Facebook, Dianna Wynn, DiannaWynn. I'm on Instagram. It's win.diana on that one. But yeah, if I see a request and that you're an artist, I'll accept that request, and we'll want to follow you in your art that way.
Perfect. Thank you so
And
much.
for me, while you will find me on Instagram, you will find me on Facebook. The reality is, I never check any of those. Maybe on LinkedIn. I should be paying more attention to LinkedIn than I do, but that's a better way to get a hold of me. If you could search for Brian Holland, Brian Holland, and you'll see the connections to Raleigh and so on. And well, they got pictures. You'll know which one if you've seen this on YouTube rather than just listen to the podcast. And the other thing is, you can always reach out on email. I think you're going to put email in the links.
For all the info.
And that's probably the surest way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you guys. We will be sure to link everything.
Excellent. And so for our listeners, if you want to become a podcast supporter, head on over to levelupartist.com to find out how you too can support the podcast.
And if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share what you have learned, you can follow us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to stay connected with the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Oh man, what an incredible conversation. I feel like so much of their advice that they gave was still applicable today. And there are a lot of new gems that I heard listening to this episode back again, now that it's been a few years since our original conversation.
Agreed. Plus, we're in a different place with our art and our businesses and our careers than we were a few years back. And it's always interesting to revisit which bits of our guest advice and experience resonated back then, which are still being applied today, which ones resonate newly. And I don't know, like some of those things that you go back and you go, they were right. They were right, like all along. Like it's just so much fun. So we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we did. And if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share your feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artist on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you in the next episode.